BMO just came out with a report that's honestly pretty eye-opening. They're saying that Canada's housing bubble isn't about to pop, that it already has. And apparently, prices have been falling for over 3 years now. We know this, even with record immigration in demand. And yes, everything is changing after that. What kind of caught my attention about this was how they're comparing it directly to the US housing crash back in 2007. And yes, I know the US housing crash was very different from what's happening in Canada. We'll get into that later, but I'll put this chart up right here. It's hard to ignore the similarities of what's happening in the Ontario real estate market, the Canadian real estate market, and in 2007 and 8 in the US. Now, BMO senior economist Robert Kavchich said everyone's been looking for bubbles in the stock market, but the real bubble that's been quietly deflating is housing. And he's pretty right about that, right? Prices peaked in early February of 2022, and they've been sliding ever since, especially in Ontario. Ontario is really the epicenter of the Canadian housing market downturn. And this isn't a quick correction, right? We've noticed this to be a very slow, grindy market downwards. And BMO has said this from the start, that this cycle would take years, not months. And it looks like that's exactly what's happening. Now, here's what's interesting. We've had record population growth, more people moving to Canada than ever before, and prices are still going down, right? We've heard from a long time, different realtors that I've heard, they say, look, Canada has record immigration. Where are all these people going to live? We had that boom, and now it's changing, right? Immigration numbers have significantly changed, right? So that whole narrative of immigration is going to keep fueling housing prices higher didn't happen. And BMO's chart shows Ontario's price trajectory is basically tracking what happened in the US right before the 2008 crash. Now, to be clear, they're not saying we're heading for the same kind of collapse, but they're saying the pattern just looks the same, right? It's effectively just data on top of each other, right? And we're just comparing it. That doesn't mean it's exactly the same thing. And I've already posted things about this, and everyone's like, oh, the 2008 crash in the US was different. And I know that. We all know that. It was a very different thing that happened. And with the US market, it corrected faster because it crashed harder. Canada's downturn is much slower, and it's probably going to drag on for a while. Now, BMO also explained how this all came together, what they called a perfect storm. You had millennials hitting their peak buying age, right? Parents jumping in to help their kids because they thought their kids would never own a home because prices were going up 10 to 20% in a year, right? So people got worried for their kids who, let's say, just turned 25 or 30, just got married, maybe planning on having a kid. We also had record immigration, pandemic-driven migration out of the cities, and ultra-low interest rates, and of course, a flood of cheap money. And on top of that, the psychology of it all, right? Everyone had extreme FOMO, right? There was multiple bids on properties. Everyone only thought that they would go up. This kind of belief is definitely what fueled asset prices to go up into bubbles like this. And now that the conditions are gone, higher rates, less liquidity, tighter budgets, it's next to impossible, as they put it, to recreate that environment again. Now, personally, I think this is the reality check that the market needed. We are going through a very natural part of the real estate market, and it doesn't mean that housing is doomed, but it does mean we're just coming back to earth. What happened was just not normal, right? Housing is not a lottery ticket, right? I think people started thinking of it less as a home and more of a get rich quick thing, which is never good. And the truth is, markets always come back to fundamentals eventually, right? Including housing. You have to factor in incomes, rents, affordability. If those things don't line up, prices eventually adjust. They have to, because there's just not enough people in the market to make prices go one way forever. And that's what we're living through right now. So for buyers and investors, this next phase is going to reward patience and long-term thinking and not speculative behavior. It's not about flipping and just prices going up all the time anymore. It's about looking at cash flow. It's about stability, buying something that actually makes financial sense. So I don't think BMO's trying to be dramatic here, right? And I'll post a chart here again. They're just comparing this to the US, and of course it's a very different scenario here, but they're just showing how the bubble deflated, right? And that it's been deflating now for 3 years. It's not the end of the world. It's just that the market is finally resetting after one of the wildest runs we've ever seen in Canadian real estate history. And of course, I do realize how different these two scenarios are. The US was basically giving out mortgages to anyone who had a heartbeat, right? Or to anyone who could breathe. So I think at one point they were actually giving out mortgages to people who didn't even have stable jobs, who maybe didn't even have a job. Also, it was fueled by mortgage-backed securities, right? The packaging of these junk products that eventually blew up, right? That's not happening in Canada, right? And Canadian banks are much more stable. They have much better balance sheets. They're also a lot more careful when they give out money to people. They do their due diligence. They make sure that someone's actually employed, right? And of course, a lot of mortgage fraud has happened, but they're really tightening up on that end. So I do think Canadian banks are much different than what was happening in 2007 in the US. That was just a crazy bonanza fest. And what we're seeing in Canada now is just the result of speculation, cheap credit, people just believing that the market would not come down, so they were doing whatever it took to get in. Of course, there was fraud and everything happening else, but I don't think that was at the crazy levels that we saw in the US in 2007 and 2008. So I do realize they are very different, but it's okay to make these comparisons. And this chart is from BMO Capital Markets, right? And so I think it's worth talking about. Let me know what you guys think about this comparison in the comments.